did the Teutonic Knights feel? That's what we're finding out today. Hello and welcome to the Medieval Grad Podcast. It's a podcast brought to you by medievalists.net, where we meet and chat with graduate students and early career researchers to learn about the new trends in medieval studies. I'm Lucie, a medieval historian and the podcast's host, and today we're talking with Patrick Eickman, a PhD candidate in history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Hi, Patrick. Thank you very much for being here.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So for a start, let's talk just a little bit about your ongoing PhD project. So you look at the Teutonic Knights during the Baltic Crusades, and more specifically, you study the emotions displayed in sources about this military order. So that everyone is on the same page, would you kind of refresh our memories and tell us about the Teutonic Knights? When was the order founded? Who were they? What was their rule? Kind of a Teutonic Knight 101 class.
Of course. I often find myself giving these when I'm explaining my work.
Yeah.
Not as famous as the Templars, but in many ways more successful. They're founded in 1190 during the Third Crusade outside the walls of Acre. They're founded by German knights and merchants who are part of the German contingent of the Third Crusade, and they had been having a really hard time during the Third Crusade. Their emperor famously drowns in a river on the way. A majority of the German crusaders go home in order to decide who's going to be the next emperor, but a small contingent continues on, and they find that during the Siege of Acre, the majority of the crusaders speak French, and this kind of leaves them out of the loop in conversations, and this could be a life or death situation when you're wounded and you're being treated in a hospital. So these German crusaders from Lubeck and Bremen, they decide that they need to form their own hospital. And it becomes known as the Teutonic House in Jerusalem. Now, they were not in Jerusalem, they're right outside of Acre, but because they are believing that they're soon going to be in Jerusalem on a successful crusade, they call themselves the Teutonic House in Jerusalem. And so even though this begins primarily as a hospital, they are not members of a military order yet, they still view themselves as crusaders. Now, they take on a military role like the Knights Hospitaller and the Knights Templar in around 1198. And this is because during the Emperor's Crusade, which is kind of the German aftermath of the Third Crusade, a number of German crusaders arrive and they conquer bits of what is today southern Lebanon. And at the end of this crusade, some of the Germans say, well, these members of the Teutonic Order, they should be a military order, just like the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller. And in a ceremony in Acre, I believe it was the Templars' headquarters, they become a military order. And this is finalized by Pope Innocent III in 1199. So by 1199, the Teutonic Knights are the Teutonic Knights. They are a full military order.
And so besides, I would say, the language, are there major differences between the Teutonic Knights, the Templars, or the Hospitallers?
Oh, I would say there are three main differences to really understand who the Teutonic Knights were. The first is their rule. So because they're a new order, there is this effort to kind of make the Teutonic Knights the best order they could be. And so they do this by combining the two rules of the Templars and Hospitallers. So on military affairs, the Teutonic Knights are going to have the rule of the Templars. But in the management of hospitals, of hospices, and charitable organizations that the Teutonic Knights are also going to run, they have the rule of the Hospitallers. The second point is the makeup of the order. So unlike knights in, say, France or England, who are part of the nobility already, knighthood in Germany is tied to a class called the minstrels. And the minstrels are a class of what we would say are serf knights. They are bound to nobles. So if you are a minstrel in Germany and you want to kind of rise your station, you would join the Teutonic Order and you kind of escape the bounds of the minstrel class. The third aspect is their success but it's also their major weakness, and it's kind of the widespread nature of the Teutonic Order. Whereas the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller are concentrated in the Latin East, and they are a unified organization. The Teutonic Knights are in there. They start off in the Latin East, so what is today Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, but they're also in the Baltic. They have plenty of houses in Germany. They even have some houses in Spain. And this leads to a sort of autonomous streak within the Teutonic Order. They do have a Grand Master, but there are autonomous branches within the Teutonic Order. Most famously, their autonomous branch in Livonia, so what is today modern Latvia and Estonia. They ostensibly answer to the Grand Master, but they have a great deal of autonomy. And this is very irregular for most military orders.
Okay. And I have maybe one last preliminary question, which is about their fate on the long run. Like the Templars, it didn't end up well for them. The Hospitallers, they still exist, like the l'Ordre des Chevaliers de Malte. So I was wondering about the Teutonic Order. Is it still something today? Yeah.
It is. So eventually what happens is even after their famous defeat against the Poles at Grunwald in the 15th century, they still managed to hold on to their territories in the Baltic. And it's not until the Protestant Reformation in which the Teutonic Order's presence in the Baltic ceases. But many of their members still remain Catholic, and they attach themselves to the Austrian Empire. This eventually ends after the Austrian Empire collapses in World War I, after World War I. And they still sort of attach themselves to the Habsburgs. It's kind of unclear what their future is. And of course, during the Nazis' rise to power, on the one hand, the Nazis view the Teutonic Order as kind of the precursors of their own political organization. But on the other hand, they don't like how the Teutonic Order of the 20th century attached themselves to the Habsburgs, who they saw as this like decadent and multicultural state. So after World War II, the Teutonic Order kind of rebuilds itself as just in almost its original capacity, as just a charitable organization.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, I'm kind of trying to do the math real quick. It's like 800 years of history, nearly a little bit more now. We are in the 21st century. It's really crazy. All right. So thank you very much for that. So now that we all have refreshed our memories about the Teutonic Knights, maybe you could do the same thing, the Baltic Crusades 101, because I think the thing is, like, most people, when we think about the Crusades, as you already mentioned, we really have in mind like the Levant, the Near East, the Holy Land, and the Baltic Crusade. They always seem to kind of come second. Oh, and for you, the listeners, if your geography is not great, the Baltic Sea stretches, I see it's in Europe, obviously, and it stretches from Denmark to modern day St. Petersburg in Western Russia. So, yeah, Patrick, sorry. Would you give us, again, a crash course on the Baltic Crusades,
Of
please?
course. Now, as you mentioned, the Baltic is an enormous region encompassing everything from northern Germany to Finland. So what is considered the Baltic Crusades actually varies. There are crusades in northern Scandinavia, in Finland, and because I focus on the German Crusades, I'm going to start in 1147. During the Second Crusade, the very famous preacher Bernard of Clairvaux is campaigning for all of Christendom to back the Second Crusade and fight back against the Seljuks. And he's very successful, but when he arrives in northern Germany, he finds that lords in Saxony and Brandenburg, they are already on their own campaigns against these pagan people called the Wends. And the Wends are a group who currently live in what is today northern Germany, and they are Western Slavs, and they are pagans. And Bernard of Clairvaux is of two minds about this. On the one hand, he supports a campaign against these people, but he's worried that these German lords are more interested in the economic benefits of conquest than the religious ones. So he states that this war should not end until the Wends are either converted or utterly destroyed. Now, the crusade itself doesn't end well. The German crusaders accidentally end up destroying Christian territory. They don't end up converting that many Wends, but it sets up the connection between conversion and crusading in the Baltic frontier. Now, this comes again in 1198 in the Livonian Crusade in what is the areas of Latvia and Estonia, when a German bishop, Berthold of Hanover, attempts to convert pagan tribesmen in the region through treaties and by building them castles. This doesn't end up working, so then he brings a armed group of troops to more forcibly make the point of conversion. And there's a battle in which the Germans win, but he is one of the only casualties on the Crusader side. And his successor, Albert of Riga, establishes the city of Riga and is able to build a Christian German state. So the Teutonic Order doesn't get involved in the Baltic Crusades until the 13th century, when Prussian tribesmen, which is, if you look at a map, it's that area of northern Poland and that little slice that Russia owns in the Baltic in the city of Kaliningrad, they begin raiding Polish territory. And a Polish duke, Conrad of Masavia, invites a Teutonic Order to subdue the Prussians. Now, both sides have different versions of what was agreed upon. 19th century Polish historians have argued that the Teutonic Order were only supposed to subdue these Prussians and then invite Conrad of Masovia to rule, and that seems to be what Conrad of Masovia had thought. Whereas the Teutonic Order, in their documentation of this, they state that no, Conrad of Masovia is saying that this land is ours.
Obviously.
Whatever happened, the Teutonic Knights arrive in about 1230, and they are able to subdue the region throughout the 13th century. Now, initially, their arrival goes pretty well, but around the 1240s, all the way up until like 1274, there's a series of these Prussian uprisings that threaten their rule in the region. When the Prussians were uprising, the Mamluks were also invading the Latin East, so the Teutonic Order's resources were split, and this eventually, the Teutonic Knights, for whatever reason, decide to focus their manpower on the Baltic and not the Latin East. Now, I suspect this is because even though the Latin East might be seen as more important in the eyes of much of Christendom, it was impossible to hold, whereas the Baltic could be held, and it was for a few hundred years.
Thank you very much. So, finally, let's move on to your research about emotions and the Teutonic Knights. Tell us what your PhD research is all about.
Oh, of course. My research deals with the possibilities provided for feelings during the Baltic Crusades. I'm looking not only at the role emotions played in the Teutonic Order, but how the Teutonic Order, through their writing, prescribes certain emotional practices for its members. So far my research has dealt with 4 chronicles. 2 of them are the Chronicles of Prussia. One is written in Latin by a Teutonic Order cleric named Peter von Duisburg. Another is the German one is written by another cleric named Nicholas von Gerischen. There is another German chronicle written by a Livonian member of the Teutonic Order called the Livonian Rhymed Chronicle. And there's one chronicle that is not written by a member of the Teutonic Order, but deals with the Baltic Crusades and is actually the earliest one, and that is the Chronicle of Henry of Livonia. And all 4 of these chronicles use emotionality in very different ways and are filled with sentimental words. It's absolutely brimming with sentimentality. I think my favorite example of this is the Chronicle of Nicholas von Gerischen. And he uses the rhymed meter of Middle High German to kind of expand upon the emotionality of his predecessor, Peter von Duisburg. In one example, when describing the miraculous finding of St. Barbara's head during one of the first of these Prussian uprisings by the Teutonic Knights, he, instead of just saying like, oh, the Teutonic Knights were happy when they found this, which is generally what Peter von Duisburg did, he describes how they find this head of St. Barbara. They all immediately start breaking down in tears, and they start running around at the head. And then they bring the head to one of their castles, in which everyone else starts crying, and they're moved by their sincere piety in their hearts. And then Nicholas von Gerischen, he directly tells his audience, you should rejoice. And then says to the land of Prussia in and of itself, rejoice, O Prussia, rejoice that God has so blessed your land. This is a wealth of for deciphering what emotionality could mean. Because on the one hand, you can say that this is reflexive of how Teutonic Knights felt in this moment. But given that Nicholas von Gerischen is directly turning to his audience and is telling them how to feel when reading this story, and given the kind of miraculous nature of the story, I think it's more, instead of viewing this as just reflexive, it's better to view this as prescriptive. Nicholas von Gerischen is telling the Teutonic Knights who could if they couldn't read Middle High German, they can certainly understood it spoken, especially in a rhymed format if it was recited, as we suspect it was, to rejoice when hearing upon their great victories, and that they were expected, while rejoicing about the blessed nature of their crusade, to shed tears to show how happy they were. So even if we can't say from reading the story how Teutonic Knights felt in that moment during the Prussian uprisings, we can say that Teutonic Knights reading this text were being told to shed tears during moments of happiness.
Yeah, especially in the presence of holy relics.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's quite a lot we can learn from just this one anecdote.
Yeah. So before we talk about more the methodology and how to approach these texts and how to interpret them, do you have more examples of emotions? And now I'm more thinking like, scenes, chronicles describing battlefield scenes. Do we have fear, adrenaline pumping? Is it like a very masculine, like in a action movie, or is
Okay.
it very religious and, God is inspiring the knights?
It depends on who you ask. Because on the one hand, the writers of these chronicles want to instill a religious piety. So they're constantly talking about the joys of martyrdom. It's an often constant refrain when reading about the Teutonic Order's defeats during these the beginnings of these Prussian uprisings, because usually that's how these uprisings begin. The Teutonic Order loses a battle, and all the Prussian tribesmen say, we can win. And they begin trying to burn down the Teutonic Order's castles. So after these defeats, there's always a description of how slain Teutonic Knights are seen joyously ascending into heaven and having meals with the Virgin Mary and being so happy about their deaths. Now, often these miracles are not narrated by Teutonic Knights. They're often narrated by religious proxies of the order, whether they be priests, literal sisters of Teutonic Knights, often living as hermits, or even just local peasants. Now, that's one side of the Teutonic Order's emotionality. And this is written by their priest members. So this goes all the way back to their rule, in which not every member of the Teutonic Order is a knight or a soldier. This is the emotionality of their priests, who see martyrdom as a source of joy. Now, there's another side. This is the side of their knight brothers, their sergeant brothers. And I think this is perfectly reflected in the Siege of Berenstain, which takes place in the Great Prussian Uprising and around the year of 1264, in which a band of Teutonic Knights sneaks out of the castle and ambushes Prussian rebels. And they're pretty successful, but eventually they're cut down. And Nicholas von Gerischen describes this as causing both joy and desolation. The ones who are joyful are the pagans, because they've just killed two Teutonic Knights and their followers. And the ones who are despondent about this are the knights still inside the castle. They are not finding any joy in the martyrdom of their comrades. They are mad or upset. Whatever we want to take how Nicholas is describing this desolation. I think there's several ways we can interpret it. So what do? Instead of piously praying for their martyred comrades, they go into the castle's dungeons, find 30 Prussian hostages, and hang them outside the walls. And immediately, the Prussians stop celebrating. I think this scene is fascinating in several ways, because not only are the Teutonic Knights rejecting the emotionality set forth by their chroniclers, which constantly are telling them like, you need to be happy when you face martyrdom. They're rejecting that, but they seem to speak the same language of emotionality that their pagan enemies have. They both understand that like we celebrate when our enemies die, and we are upset when our own friends are killed. There's another scene that really illustrates this, and that's I think probably one of the funniest scenes in the Teutonic Order's Chronicles, in which this Teutonic knight, a brother Ludwig, is being held prisoner by a Lithuanian leader called Scumantus. And he is invited over to a Lithuanian party in which he is repeatedly insulted by this other Lithuanian warrior. And Ludwig is getting really upset and asks his captor, "Why did you even bring me here?" And Scumantus says, like, "Well, if you're upset, why don't you do, I understand you're upset. I give you permission to do something about it, because we're both military aristocrats and we both have the same code of honor. And even though you're my enemy, I do expect you to stand up for yourself." So in the Chronicles' own language, Ludwig angrily draws a sword and just kills one of his the man insulting him. And the Lithuanians are so impressed by this display of anger that they free him. Eventually, Scumantus later converts to Christianity. So the lesson for Teutonic Knights is quite clear. Our pagan enemies might be thralls of the devil. They might be irrationally angry. They might, even if they convert to Christianity, they might never truly be full members of Christendom. But their anger, we speak on this level of aristocratic anger, and it can be used to make them join our side. And this is not taken well by the clerical members within Baltic crusading structures. So Henry of Livonia, when he's describing crusading raids in Estonia, he blames the brutality of these raids on the auxiliary forces of the Crusaders, their Livonian and Lettish allies, saying that they are very cruel and angry people. So even when they are Christian, he says that like these people are always angry and they just can't help themselves. So he sees Baltic anger as a problem that can be used to explain away Crusader brutality. Whereas the Teutonic Knights seem to see Baltic anger as like, actually, this is a point of commonality. This is great. We can actually convert them using their anger. So while it's tempting to see Baltic and German Crusaders as kind of all on the same page, they're not. And I think studying emotions is a great window into seeing just how complicated the Baltic Crusades were.
All right, Patrick. So maybe my last question would be, what are you hoping to find out or to demonstrate at the end of your research?
So what I'm trying to demonstrate, or what I hope to find out, is whether these texts reflect the feelings of Teutonic Knights, whether we can truly know how a Teutonic Knight felt in moments of battle, or if these texts are purely for prescribing certain emotional practices. I suspect it is a mix of both. I think the anecdote that perfectly illustrates this is the story of Conrad of Thuringia. So he is the 5th Grand Master of the Teutonic Order, and he is the kind of one of their first members from the major nobility. So he's not a minstrel. And the Chronicles, when they're describing how he joins, they pay particular attention to how he was feeling. And according to these chronicles, he joins after a courtesan pricks at his consciousness about his sinful ways. And he decides to go to a town he formerly sacked and beg for forgiveness. And he goes from door to door crying, begging people to beat him with a cane. And all of the citizens are weeping and no one will partake because, oh, what a noble man. And eventually Conrad's tears persuade other members of the major nobility to go and join the order. Now, it's quite clear that what the chroniclers are doing here is telling Teutonic Knights, like, well, whenever you perform contrition, you need to show that you are sad. And we do have evidence in other medieval texts that people would practice acts of contrition in order to weep, and this would show their true sincerity. And it's important for the Teutonic Knights to be seen as truly penitent, because military orders in the 14th century are increasingly criticized for being seen as like not being religious enough. On the other hand, this anecdote, it really focuses on the fact that Conrad did bad things. That as a military man in the German lands, he hurt his own people, but now that he has been reminded of his sinfulness, he goes out and can do military actions in a good way, in a way that is benefiting Christendom and will get him to heaven. And I think a Teutonic Knight, hearing this story, might have genuinely be moved by this. And the Teutonic Order would provide for this member, feeling sad, and perhaps being moved to tears, a way to remedy this. Now, what's perhaps a little disturbing is that the Teutonic Order's solution for feelings was violence. Whether a Teutonic Knight was angry, was sad, or was happy, the solution is killing pagans, or at least killing them enough until they join Christianity. So there's kind of almost a genealogy here in which the supposed feelings of Teutonic Knights in the 13th century, these feelings are militarized by these chronicles and then projected onto the knights hearing these stories, and it is then supposed to be used for further violence, which then would arguably recreate the cycle in which the violence then traumatizes the knights fighting these battles, and then these knights can re-traumatize future members of the order, and it keeps the violence going.
So thank you very, very much, Patrick. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you. It was great to be here.
That was Patrick Eickman, and you can find out more about him in the show notes. Stay with us because the episode isn't over yet. Let's bring in Peter Konieczny from medievalist.net. Hi, Peter. How are you? What did you think of this episode?
Well, hi, thanks. I'm doing pretty well. And yeah, I'm really glad you had Patrick on. He's actually a friend of mine. So
Really?
We've been on Facebook. I met him a couple years ago at conferences, and I've had him write a little bit for me in Medieval Warfare magazine. So I really actually, quite like his stuff. So he's been doing like this. It's interesting, this take, like looking at the kind of sentimental, the emotional. I really like that. It's kind of like trying to figure out what Crusaders are thinking, or more accurately, probably what chroniclers are telling Crusaders to think, right? Like the kind of more the religious lead saying, "Hey, this is how you should think about what you're doing." So
Yes.
I really like his kind of work. And it was a really good kind of overview, actually, if you wanted to know about like the Baltic Crusades, about the Teutonic Knights. A really quick piece. So I'm really glad he's working on that.
Yes, sometimes I ask the guests to give me a crash course, and usually it's because mainly I don't know much about that particular topic.
Yeah.
I know a lot of stuff about certain things, but like the Baltic Crusade, I have no clues. So I think it was also a good refresher for me.
Oh, yeah, indeed. Like it's one of those areas that doesn't get a lot of coverage, right? But for
Yeah.
like it deserves like a lot more. And like I said, these chronicles are coming up. There's more sources, a lot of archaeological stuff too, especially coming out of Poland. So I know that they recently did some finds at the Battle of Grunwald site, which were interesting. So yeah, lots of places to go there.
And so a lot of things to read on the website about the Baltic Crusades, I guess.
Indeed. Like I would actually suggest, though, that you also take a look at a book by Stephen Spencer. It's called "Emotions in a Crusading Context." So it deals with the Holy Land Crusades primarily. First Crusade to 1291, and Patrick actually did a book review of it on the military website. So so I can see where like his ideas are coming from a lot. Like, hey, this is happening in the Holy Land. How can it is reflective of what's happening there in the Baltics? So Yeah, so I would recommend that. And there's always like a kind of a ton of stuff coming out, especially the Crusade text and translations series. It's now through Rutledge, so they've got some stuff of it specifically for these Baltic Crusades.
All right. Thank you very much, Peter.
Thanks.
You were listening to the Medieval Grad Podcast, brought to you by medievalists.net. You can subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcast, wherever you listen to your podcast, and leave it 5 stars and a good review. And yes, you heard me say it. And if you want to support us and this podcast, you can subscribe to our Patreon, patreon.com/medievalists. You can get a lot of great benefits on Patreon, including being able to hear the show episodes early. I love doing this podcast and I really appreciate your help. I'm Lucie Lemonnier. You can find me on Instagram at The French Medievalist, and you can look me up on academia.edu. Thank you very much for listening. Au revoir!